A boy was sent to the middle of the ocean for 1 year so that he could conduct weather investigation and research there. He was offered such a big salary that he didn't even care for his life. When he reached there, the officer who had been stationed in that old lighthouse for a year was nowhere to be seen. The boy started living there alone. Then one night, from the depths of the ocean, a strange creature emerged, a woman who was neither human nor jinn, but she was extremely beautiful, so beautiful that it was impossible to take one's eyes off her. That night, she came close to the boy, and slowly, the two became addicted to each other. Now that creature began to come every night, and the boy could no longer live without her. A year passed, but when the time came to return, the boy refused. He said, "I will stay here now for life." After all, who was that creature? Neither human nor jinn. Then what kind of laughter was hers that made a man give up the world for her? And what did she make him do that he sacrificed everything and made the ocean his eternal home? In the deep silence of the sea, a small research team was heading toward a deserted island in the middle of the ocean. Their destination was a place where no human lived, no birds flew, only the rage of waves and the madness of the wind existed. Among the crew on the ship, the youngest but the most important member was Aditya Sharma, a young weather officer. The government had appointed him there for a year to study the changing climate of the island. All equipment, food, conditions, and living arrangements were already prepared. After many days of travel, when the ship neared the island, the sight looked like something out of a legend. Blue sea, silent sky, and in the middle a lonely island, as if the world had forgotten it. As soon as they landed on the shore, silence spread all around. No bird, no sign of life. Only the echo of waves and the sigh of wind. In the center of the island stood an old lighthouse, and beside it a small house. That was Aditya's new home, where before him the weather officer Raghav Varma had been stationed. But when the team opened the door of that house, there was chaos inside. Things scattered, papers flying, chairs overturned, as if someone had suddenly run away, leaving everything behind. Captain Rajiv Singh and Aditya looked at each other, then walked toward the lighthouse. But when they reached there, their steps stopped. The entire lighthouse was sealed, with sharp wooden stakes and iron bars, as if someone had intentionally locked it up. Rajiv banged on the door hard. No answer. Finally, he pushed it open. With a creak, the door opened, and an old man stood inside, Govinnath. Rajiv asked, "Where's the previous officer, Raghav?" Govind said coldly, "He went toward the sea and never came back." The captain fell silent. Even the air around seemed to stop. He said to Aditya, "If you want, you can return with us. This place isn't right." But Aditya refused. In his heart was only one thought: if I can complete this work, my name will be made. Thus Aditya decided, no matter how silent or dangerous this island was, he would spend the year here. Before leaving, Captain Rajiv handed him a gun. "This place doesn't feel safe," he said. "Take care of yourself." The ship's engine faded into the ocean, and soon they disappeared beyond the waves. Now, only one person remained on the island, Aditya. Quietly, he cleaned his new home, straightened the broken table, swept the floor, and arranged all the supplies. Night had fallen. The moon shone dimly behind clouds. When Aditya opened a drawer, he found an old diary, the diary of the former weather officer, Raghav Varma. The pages were yellow, but the words were alive. The diary mentioned the island and a mysterious creature that emerged from the sea at night. Some sentences were incomplete, as if the writer had suddenly stopped. Aditya thought maybe Raghav had been lonely and wrote such stories to pass time. On a few pages, strange sketches were drawn, half human, half beast, blue skin and hollow eyes. On one page, there was also a photo of Raghav's wife, a delicate face, like she was peeking from behind a veil. Reading the diary, Aditya's eyelids grew heavy, and after a while, he drifted into sleep. The next morning, he went toward the shore. Between the rocks, he saw some stones and shells, arranged in a special pattern, as if someone had made a symbol. He thought maybe it was Govind's doing, and got back to work. As evening fell, he looked through the binoculars, toward the lighthouse. For a moment, he felt someone else was standing with Govind, but before he could blink, the scene vanished. Maybe an illusion, he muttered. Night deepened. While Aditya was busy writing notes, there was a soft knock at the door. "Who is it?" he said. No answer. Holding a lamp, he slowly walked toward the door. Suddenly, a deep sound echoed, as if someone groaned from the depths of the sea, and then a long blue hand with thin fingers slid under the door. Aditya's breath froze. He ran straight to the basement and hid in the darkness. The door creaked open. Something had entered. It moved slowly, peering into every corner of the room. Aditya peeped through a crack in the wall. Suddenly, the creature stopped, as if it sensed something, then leapt toward the wall and thrust its hand inside the crack. Aditya's hands trembled, but he quickly grabbed a knife and stabbed the creature's eye with full force. A terrifying scream echoed. The thing staggered back, stumbled, and disappeared into the dark. Panting, Aditya sank to the ground. Now he was sure. Raghu's diary wasn't a lie. This island was alive, and he was now trapped in it. The echo of that night still haunted Aditya's mind. He now knew that everything in Raghu's diary was true. He sat by the window all night, watching every shadow with fear. When morning came, he saw strange, large footprints in the sand, leading straight into the sea. Now there was no doubt. He wasn't alone on the island. He understood why Govind had surrounded the lighthouse with sharp stakes. If he stayed in that house, the creature would surely return one day. Panicking, he ran toward the lighthouse. "Govind, open the door! Let me in!" he shouted. From above came Govind's harsh voice. "You should have left with the ship that day." Then he threw a bucket of water down, pushing Aditya away. Silently, Aditya returned. Now he had to protect himself. He shut all the windows, placed sharp planks around the walls, and piled old papers and books near the door, sprinkling them with oil. If it comes back, he thought, fire will stop it. But he didn't know that night was going to reveal a new truth. Evening descended, the sky turned red, and darkness began to crawl in. In one corner of the room, he noticed an old wooden box. Inside were a gun and several bullets. For a moment, he felt perhaps fate hadn't abandoned him yet. As the night grew deeper, Aditya hid in a corner with the gun in his hand. His heartbeat raced. Then suddenly, a sound arose, deep and heavy, as if the ocean itself was breathing. Aditya peeked through the window crack, and his eyes widened. From the surface of the water, dozens of blue creatures were emerging. Their bodies glowed, their eyes blazed like fire, and their movements were not human. Within moments, they reached the door of the house. A loud thud, then another. The whole wall began to shake. Aditya held the gun and fired. Some creatures screamed and fell back into the sea, but the rest became even more furious. He quickly ran out, set fire to the papers near the door. Flames leapt high, their light slicing through the darkness. The creatures began to retreat. Then, with a piercing scream, they fled toward the sea. He breathed a sigh of relief, but then the reflection of light on his face changed. The fire was no longer confined to papers. It had spread from the door to the walls. The whole house began to wrap itself in flames. Aditya, who had just escaped death, was now trapped inside his own burning home. The door had turned into a blazing inferno. The entire house was made of wood, so the fire spread quickly. In panic, Aditya wrapped himself in a thick blanket and somehow managed to run out through the flames. He ran toward the lighthouse and hid behind a large rock nearby. There was a deep wound on his hand. Blood was flowing. Suddenly, black clouds covered the sky, and within moments, heavy rain began to fall. He hid behind the rocks all night, while the rain slowly extinguished the fire. When morning came, the sight was heartbreaking. Adifir's house had been completely reduced to ashes. He had nothing left now. No shelter, no food, no peace. There was only one way to survive. The lighthouse. He picked up his gun, tied a cloth around his wound, and hid among the rocks, waiting for Govind to come out. After several hours, Govind finally came out with a bucket to fetch water. Adifir slowly followed him from behind. But suddenly, from between the rocks, a bluish, slimy creature leapt out and attacked him. Adifir fought with all his strength, holding the creature down as it writhed and screamed. Just then, Govind came running, shouting, "Stop! That one is mine." Adifir was shocked. "Yours?" he said, pointing the gun. Govind, panting, replied, "She's my pet. Don't harm her." Adifir aimed the gun at the creature and said, "If you want her to live, then let me stay inside the lighthouse. Otherwise, I'll shoot her right now." Govind stood silent for a moment, then slowly bowed his head. He knew Adifir had both food and ammunition. Being enemies would only lead to destruction. By evening, both of them returned to the lighthouse. Adifir was astonished. Now a new secret had been revealed to him. This creature was no ordinary animal. "How did you tame her?" Adifir asked. Govind took a deep breath. "One day, she got caught in my net. She was small back then. I let her go. Since then, she never left me. She obeys everything I say." Adifir looked closely at the creature. There was a human-like gleam in her eyes, but centuries of pain on her face. The other was a different creature, but both were prisoners of freedom. Adifir gave that creature a name, Anaria. Days passed, and the noise of the island's nights slowly began to fade. Where once screams and gunshots echoed, now an eerie silence spread. One day Adifir noticed that the attacks were becoming fewer. "Maybe they go somewhere else during winter," he said. But Govind interrupted. "No, they'll come again. Now they're increasing their numbers." A few days went by. One night, after dinner, both of them sat down to play chess. They got so lost in the game that they forgot to light the lighthouse. Darkness covered everything. Suddenly, the sea waves began to boil. Terrifying sounds came from afar, and from beneath the water, dozens of creatures emerged. Their bodies glowed like blue flames. Govind began firing. Adifir picked up his gun too, but his hands were trembling. The bullets were about to finish. No plan, no hope, fighting and retreating. Both reached the top of the lighthouse. During the struggle, one of the creatures bit deep into Govind's leg. Blood gushed out, but he kept firing. Fear of death rippled through Adifir's heart. But just then, the first ray of sunlight broke in the east. And as the light spread, all the creatures screamed and vanished back into the sea. In the blazing sunlight, Anaria appeared at the lighthouse door. She walked slowly, poured water on Govind's wounds, and silently applied medicine. Adifir watched this scene, and, for the first time, realized this monster was in fact a being capable of emotion. But a bitter truth had already settled in his heart. We cannot win this war. The bullets were few. The food supplies were running out. Now there was nothing left, only to wait for death or a miracle. The next day, Adifir was walking near the shore when he saw a ship far out at sea. Hope returned to his eyes. He ran inside, grabbed a flare gun, and fired into the sky. But suddenly, Govind rushed forward and stopped him. "Stop. No fire." Adifir shouted, "Why? That ship can save us." Madness flashed in Govind's eyes. "You're not going anywhere. This island is mine, my world, my kingdom." Adifir was about to speak, when suddenly, Anaria leapt at Govind. She wanted to protect Adifir. Govind, enraged, pushed her away. Anaria screamed. Her voice echoed through the air. Govind's face turned red with obsession. He was no longer just a king. He had become a captive king, who couldn't bear to see anyone free. Adifir now understood. Govind was trapped in a prison of his own mind. He feared that if Adifir escaped, he would reveal the secret of these sea creatures to the world. Meanwhile, the ship slowly disappeared into the mist of the sea. Adifir stood silently, Realizing now that this island was his prison, and Govind his warden, days passed in silence. Govind's anger grew, and the target of his fury became poor Anarya. One night, wounded and trembling, she came to Aditya. There were tears in her eyes. "Come with me," she whispered. "I want to show you something." Both of them walked toward that hidden part of the island, where perhaps no human had ever set foot. When Aditya saw the old boat lying there, a new hope flickered inside him. Maybe this is the way out of this hell. When he asked Govind about the boat, Govind smiled as if he already knew. "Yes, I knew there was a boat in that part of the island." Then, in a heavy voice, he said, "Once, some people came here seeking refuge in that boat. But before morning, they were all gone. Those creatures left no one alive." Govind continued, "They were coming with a ship full of ammunition, but a sea storm dragged them here, and their ship sank near this island." Hearing that, a new idea sparked in Aditya's mind. If we can reach that wreck, maybe we can find dynamite or bullets. They had an old diving suit. Heavy but useful. Govind immediately refused. That's suicide. Going there means inviting death. But Aditya was determined. If we want to live, we must take the risk. Days passed. A quiet, gentle bond had begun to form between Aditya and Anarya. They had started to understand each other's loneliness, and that was something Govind could not bear. One night, he saw them together, and at that moment, hatred and jealousy filled his heart. He had now decided, Aditya must die. The next morning, he spoke in a calm tone. "All right, I agree. You wear the suit, go down, bring back the dynamite, and I'll pull you up with a rope." But behind that calm face was a hidden plan. He wanted Aditya to get trapped in the sea's depths, killed by the creatures, so that all the dynamite and power would return to his hands. Both reached the spot where the ship had sunk. Aditya put on the heavy diving suit, took a deep breath, and descended into the dark water. The depth increased, the light dimmed, and when he finally reached the bottom, he saw the wrecked ship, completely shattered, but inside, some boxes were still intact. Luck favored him. Some contained dynamite, safe and dry. Suddenly, there was movement in the dark water. A few creatures appeared before him. Aditya's heart froze. He slipped and fell. The weight of the metal suit pinned him to the ground. He couldn't move. He couldn't even send a signal upward. Above, Govind thought, "It's over." But the truth was different. The creatures standing before Aditya were actually two small children, frightened, weak, and curious. With great effort, Aditya steadied himself, left the suit behind, and swam back to the surface. There he found some old boxes filled with safe dynamite. After returning, both of them, Aditya and Govind, worked day and night. They laid dynamite in 2 layers, all around the lighthouse, so that when the creatures attacked again, one explosion would end everything. Months passed, and now, in Aditya's heart, only one prayer remained. May the next attack be the last one. Snow had begun to fall. The cold air above the sea cut like knives. Yet, in that weather, there was a strange sense of peace. Those creatures, who used to come every night, had suddenly disappeared. No noise, no screams. It was as if the island had fallen asleep. Suspicion began to grow in Govind's heart. "This silence is not normal," he said. "Maybe Anarya has warned them." In anger, he attacked her, but Aditya stepped in between and stopped him. Harsh words were exchanged between the two. Then came a decision, a new plan. The plan was simple. The lighthouse door would be left open. When the creatures entered, the dynamite would explode and destroy everything in one instant. Aditya carefully prepared the whole plan. Anarya, you go to the roof and scream, so that they get provoked by your voice. Anarya nodded softly, and the very next moment, her scream echoed across the sea. The water trembled. From the depths, blue bodies began to rise. They roared and climbed up the walls. And when they saw the main gate of the lighthouse open, that became their biggest mistake. Within moments, they rushed inside. Diffier picked up his gun. Bullets fired. Smoke, screams, and splashing water. Everything mixed together. But they were too many. At that moment, Govind pulled the lever, but there was no explosion. Silence. Only the growls of the creatures. Sweat gathered on Diffier's face. The connection, he muttered, and ran upstairs, his trembling hands trying to reconnect the wires. Down below, Govind was fighting alone. With every shot, the walls shook. Diffier finally completed the connection, and the first layer exploded. A circle of light burst open, and dozens of creatures screamed as they scattered into the air. But some were still alive. Govind pressed the second lever. A massive explosion followed. The ground shook, the sky filled with black smoke, and then silence. Both of them fainted. When the morning sunlight fell on the walls, Diffier opened his eyes. Destruction was all around. By the shore lay dozens of bodies, burned flesh and the stench of blood. Anaria was nowhere to be seen. Govind, gun in hand, was shooting the wounded creatures that were still breathing. Diffier's eyes fell upon one burned creature. A necklace hung around its neck. It was breathing its last, and in its eyes there was not pain, but prayer. In that moment, Diffier's heart shattered. He realized these creatures were not monsters. They were living souls, fighting for their loved ones, capable of love, of suffering, just silent like humans. But for Govind, it meant nothing. He picked up his gun again and shot the last surviving creature. After that day, the creatures never returned. Yet every night, the sound of faint weeping came with the sea waves, as if a mother was calling for her lost children. Regret boiled inside Diffier's heart. He now understood. The real monsters were not the creatures. Perhaps he himself had become one. Diffier sat by the shore, drawing a small circle with pebbles. In the center, he placed a tiny wooden boat, the same boat that once rested in Anaria's hands. He wished that if she was still alive, she would see the sign and return. He sat there for hours. The sun set, the moon rose, but Anaria did not return. Finally, exhausted, he fell asleep there. When morning came, Govind was sleeping nearby. Beside him were some old things, rusted maps, torn books, and an old photograph. Diffier picked up the photo, and his heart nearly stopped. In the picture was the same woman, whose photo he had seen in Raghav's diary. Raghav's wife, and the man standing beside her was no stranger. It was Govind himself. Now everything was clear. Raghav hadn't died. He was alive, but had changed his identity, and was living on this island as Govind. After losing his wife, he had broken away from the world, and made this island his prison, his kingdom. A cold shiver ran through Diffier's heart. He understood now. This island wasn't just Govind's prison. It had become his own as well. He too was slowly becoming the same, lonely and silent. That evening, he went to the shore again. The little boat that he had placed inside the circle was no longer there, but in its place stood a small creature, holding that very boat in its tiny hands. Diffier smiled softly and placed a burning stick into the circle, his silent signal. He didn't want to fight anymore. He only wanted peace. Soon, the sea waves began to rise again, and then Anaria appeared, with dozens of creatures behind her. But this time, there was no rage on their faces. In their eyes was only a plea, a longing for peace. They all stood silently. They weren't enemies, just being seeking a safe place for their children. Suddenly, from the direction of the lighthouse, Govind appeared, gun in hand, and the same old madness in his eyes. "What is this to show?" he shouted. It was as if the island had fallen asleep. A seed of doubt took root in Govind's heart. This silence was not ordinary. He said, "Maybe Anaria has warned them." In anger, he lashed out at her, but Diffier stepped in between and stopped him. Harsh words were exchanged between the two. Then came a decision, a new plan. The plan was simple. Leave the lighthouse door open. When the creatures entered, the dynamite would blow everything up in an instant. Diffier cleverly set up the entire trap. "Anaria," he said, "go to the roof and scream, so that they are provoked by your voice." Anaria nodded slowly, and the next moment her scream echoed across the sea. The water trembled. From the depths, blue bodies began to rise. They roared and screamed, climbing up the walls. They saw that the main gate of the lighthouse was open, their greatest mistake. Within moments, they rushed inside. A diffier picked up his gun. Shots were fired. Smoke, screams, and splashes of water mixed into chaos. But there were too many of them. At that moment, Govind pulled the lever, but there was no explosion. Silence. Only the roaring of the creatures. Sweat gathered on a diffier's face. "The connection," he muttered. He ran upstairs and, with trembling hands, began fixing the wires. Below, Govind fought alone. With every bullet, the walls shook. A diffier completed the connection. The first layer exploded. A circle of light formed, and dozens of creatures screamed and scattered into the air. But some were still alive. Govind pulled the second lever. A deafening blast followed. The ground trembled. The sky filled with thick black smoke. Then silence. Both of them fell unconscious. When the morning sun hit the walls, a diffier opened his eyes. Destruction lay all around. By the shore, dozens of bodies, burnt flesh and the smell of blood. Anaria was nowhere to be found. Govind, holding a gun, was killing the wounded creatures still breathing. A diffier's eyes fell on one burned creature. Around its neck hung a necklace. It was taking its last breath, and in its eyes there was no pain, only prayer. In that moment, a diffier's heart broke. He realized these creatures were not monsters. They were living souls, fighting for their loved ones, capable of love, of pain, just like humans, only silent. But for Govind, all this meant nothing. He raised his gun and shot the last surviving creature dead. After that day, the creatures never returned. But every night, with the waves of the sea, faint cries could be heard, as if a mother was calling out for her lost children. Regret began to burn inside a diffier's heart. He now understood the real monsters were not those creatures. Perhaps the monster was himself. A diffier sat by the shore, arranging small stones into a circle. In the center, he placed a small wooden boat, the same one that had once been in Anaria's hands. He hoped that if she was alive, she would see the sign and return. He waited there for hours. The sun set. The moon rose. But Anaria did not return. At last, he fell asleep right there. When he woke in the morning, Govind was sleeping nearby. Beside him were some old items, rusty maps, torn books, and an old photograph. A diffier picked up the picture, and in the next instant his heart froze. In the photo was the same woman he had seen in Raghav's diary, Raghav's wife, and the man standing beside her was no stranger. It was Govind himself. Everything became clear. Raghav had not died. He was alive, living on this island disguised as Govind. After losing his wife, he had broken from the world and made this island his own kingdom. A chill ran through a diffier's heart. He now understood the island was not just Govind's prison, but his own as well. He, too, was slowly becoming the same, lonely, silent, detached. That evening, he went back to the shore. The small boat inside the circle was gone, but in its place stood a tiny creature, holding the same boat in its small hands. A diffier smiled softly and placed a burning stick inside the circle, his signal. He did not want to fight. He wanted peace. Within moments, the sea waves began to rise. Then Anaria emerged, followed by dozens of creatures. But this time, there was no terror on their faces, only a silent plea for peace. They stood still. They were not enemies, just beings seeking a safe home for their children. Suddenly, from the direction of the lighthouse, Govind appeared, gun in hand, eyes burning with old madness. "What is this nonsense?" he roared. "These creatures are our enemies." A diffier replied gently, "No, Govind, they don't want to fight anymore. They just want to live in peace and freedom." Govind ignored him. He aimed his gun at Anaria and shouted, "Get inside." But Anaria did not move. There was no fear on her face anymore, only the courage born after centuries of slavery. Sweat formed on Govind's forehead. His finger trembled on the trigger. The king inside him, the self-proclaimed ruler of the lighthouse, was breaking apart. No one was obeying him anymore. Not Adithier, not Aneria, not even the silent sea that seemed to have rebelled against him. Slowly, he began walking toward the lighthouse. Adithier thought maybe he had realized his mistake, that he had changed. But he was wrong. The madness still burned on Govind's face, as if the sea's darkness had swallowed him whole. Adithier ran toward the lighthouse, and on the other side, Govind, now completely lost in insanity, pulled out a signal gun and fired into the sky. The sky flashed, and the burning flare struck a small creature's child. The child fell to the ground, motionless. The entire shore froze. Aneria's scream echoed through the air. Terrified, the creatures retreated into the sea. Rage and sorrow flared inside Adithier. He shouted in pain. Why did you do this? They only wanted peace. Govind's face was twisted with madness. He roared, I am their king. If I am gone, who will rule here? He picked up an iron rod and charged toward Adithier. Adithier stepped back and, after a moment of silence, said, Stop, Raghav. Govind froze. Adithier's voice was calm but echoing. Yes, you are Raghav, the same weather officer who was once stationed here. You didn't die. You just changed. Your name, your face, your voice. But the loneliness inside you remained alive. Emptiness filled Govind's face. The rod slipped from his hand. Tears welled up in his eyes. Adithier said softly, You are not a murderer, Raghav. All this is just the noise of your pain. Your wife's death, your loneliness. They turned you into this monster. These creatures were never your enemies. They just wanted to return home. For the first time, tears flowed from Govind's eyes. He lowered his head and slowly walked out of the lighthouse. He stopped by the shore, dropped his gun, and raised his arms. I was wrong, he said in a trembling voice. I asked forgiveness from all of them. The waves began to rise. The creatures emerged once again from the sea. Their cries were not of terror this time, but mourning. In moments, they surrounded Govind. And with the waves, he slowly sank, forever. Adithier stood silently. Then he returned inside the lighthouse, closed the door, and looked out the window toward the sea. Time passed. Rains came. Storms blew. A year later, a government boat approached the island. A new weather officer and an inspector arrived. They asked Adithier, Where's the previous officer? Adithier simply replied, He went toward the sea, but never came back. The officer nodded, perhaps assuming that Adithier himself was Govind, the old keeper of the lighthouse. Adithier did not correct him. He quietly walked to the balcony and looked toward the sea. Where once there was fear, now there was only peace. A gentle breeze flowed. A faint smile appeared on Adithier's lips. He no longer wished to leave, just like Govind once did. And beyond the sea, Aneria lived freely with her people. No prison, no ruler, only silent waves and the breath of freedom.